My name's Rosemary Muge. I'm a retired person doing this just out of interest, just because I've got hooked on it. And what happened was I was a teacher, and as the children got older and I got a bit bored with teaching, I went over to just teaching half-time, and at the same time I took up doing some open university courses just on things that interested me. They ended up hanging together to make a degree, so I had a degree. And by then I was teaching in a prison, it being much easier to teach in a prison than in a comprehensive school. And that made me very interested in the people who are called criminals. And so I went on to do with the Open University an MA in crime and policing, 1750 to 1900. And during the course of that I got hooked on poaching. And there's a really fascinating book by John Archer called By a Flash and a Scare, Arson, Animal Maiming and Poaching in East Anglia. And it's one of those books that strides this divide. It's a book for academic historians, but it's also a book for the general public. And because I was living in East Anglia, and because my father's family came from Norfolk as well, I just got really hooked on poaching by that. So when we moved to Nottinghamshire, I approached Nottingham University to see if they'd have me, because I didn't want just to research on my own, because I enjoy the academic rigour. I mean, some people think I'm mad, but I actually enjoy having work I've done criticised and feeling that I'm learning and feeling that I'm being made to get better at the way I'm doing things. And I'm also very interested in process. I'm not just interested in static pictures of history. I'm interested in how things work as well. So I'm in my third year of a part-time PhD. And I think it's going all right, except I've got so much data that if I'm ever going to be able to synthesise it and present it, I doubt sometimes. My actual research is ongoing, so I'm not able to present very much that's very coherent as a result of my research. A lot of what I tell you will be from secondary sources. I've thought a bit about how I'll structure this, and I thought I'd start by saying something about the 19th century, i.e. the 1800s. So I thought I'd start by talking about how things were up until 1831. Because in 1831 there was a Poaching Reform Act that changed the law a lot, but didn't change how things were on the ground that much. So to start with, I'll talk about the state of the laws, preservation and sport, consumption of game and the black market prior to 1831. Then I'll talk about the extent to which 1831 changed that. Then I'll talk about who poached, who were the poachers, and a bit about how historians have seen it, and how the historians' view of it has changed, and how it's now seen to the extent to which there is a consensus. Then I'll talk about why I think people poached, and then I'm looking at three counties, Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire and Leicestershire, and so I'll talk about how things might differed a bit between Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire and Derbyshire. And then I'll talk a bit about a phrase, because people always like to hear about a good fight, and I'll give you some details of some individual affrays. Right, the poaching laws at the beginning of the 19th century were as they had been from 1671. And after the restoration of the monarchy, historians feel that it was as a move to placate the landed gentry, really, and to make them feel that they were important. The Game Law Act of 1671 was passed, and it remained unchanged until 1831, more or less. All that changed was the punishments that you could get for infringing it. What was actually against the law didn't change, although the punishments you could get for infringing it got worse and worse during the 1700s. And basically, you had to be a gentleman to be allowed to take game. And game was defined as all the sort of things you'd expect, like pheasants and partridges, and there are a host of other game birds. Grouse is one. Deer and rabbits were not counted as game. Deer and rabbits were counted as people's possessions. So you definitely weren't allowed to take them either, because they were the property of the person whose land it was. But deer and rabbits at that stage didn't fall under the heading of game. So to take game, you had to be a gentleman, and quite a high-up gentleman as well. There were regulations about what the value of the land that you owned had to be in order for you to be allowed to take game. and you had to be an esquire or a son of an esquire, the eldest son of an esquire, to take it. And this meant that, in fact, quite a lot of quite well-off people who owned land weren't allowed to take the game that lived on their land, which is an extraordinary state of affairs, really, and gave rise to a lot of bad feeling, not just from the poor about the game laws, but up until 1831, gave rise to a lot of bad feeling from quite a lot of well-to-do people who thought of themselves as gentry, because they weren't allowed to take game even if they owned the land. And that applied to rabbits as well. You know, you weren't allowed to take the rabbits on your own land. Tenant farmers, and most farmers were tenant farmers of the big estates, weren't allowed to do anything about the game that was eating their grain and destroying their vegetables. They weren't allowed to destroy it in any way. There were separate laws for deer, and deer, of course, were very prohibited. And in the 1830s, the Black Act was passed, which was essentially about deer poaching, and the sort of deer poaching that went on in around Richmond and in Hampshire, in the rural forests there, was really a very different sort of poaching. It was very much an act of defiance as well as poaching. I mean, some of the people that were taking part in the deer poaching that the Black Act was passed to stop were quite well-to-do people. There was dressing up and there was disguising yourself. And there was even some element of a slightly Robin Hoodish thing about it, in that sometimes the perpetrators of this sort of deer poaching threatened and intervened in disputes that they thought were wrong, i.e. if somebody owed a trader a lot of money and weren't paying it, then they would actually get intimidated by some of these people. So that sort of poaching was very different to what was going on in the 1900s, and deer poaching just doesn't seem to have been relevant at all round here in the 1900s. There were very, very few deer left, and what deer were left were very thoroughly parked and very thoroughly protected. And I haven't come across in the newspapers or the parliamentary returns that show where they mention what it was people were doing, any instance of anybody being prosecuted for taking deer. So it just, by the 1900, round here, it seems to have become a non-issue. So up until 1831, you've got the situation that quite a lot of people who were well-to-do and who regarded themselves as gentry were poaching during the day and were occasionally getting prosecuted for it. But the vast majority of people who were getting prosecuted for it and who were doing it were, of course, working-class people. It was obviously extremely common. Preservation, that is looking after the animals that are on your land and cosseting them, really started to grow in the middle of the 18th century, in the sort of 1750s, where the shooting that the gentry did began to change its nature. A gentleman, instead of going out with a few friends and his dogs and shooting over a dog, i.e. going through his woods, his own land, and his dog finding the game for him and pointing at it, I think they just sort of stood there, sticking their noses forward to show where the game was. And then the gentleman would shoot it and the dog would retrieve it. That sort of sport began to be replaced by what became known as the battue, B-A-T-T-U-E, which sort of came in from the continent. And later on in the 19th century, Prince Albert was incredibly keen on it. And it meant that it was mostly pheasants, but they did shoot partridge as well, and they would shoot rabbits, and they would shoot hares if they saw them. But a lot of the time, most of the time, it was pheasants more than anything else. Would be either driven towards them for them to be shot by beaters, or would be driven up against a net that had been put across, so that you got vast numbers of birds flying up, and they could shoot them repeatedly. And the gentleman could have, I call him a gentleman, and it seems a bit of a respectful term, doesn't it? Needless to say, I don't mean it in that way. But they were literally gentlemen in that was their status in society. Would have his servant with him who would reload his guns and hand them to him so that he could rapidly shoot as many as possible. And a fellow student at the university recently let me have something that he'd come across looking through some estate papers, and it was an excited letter that this lady, this countess, had received from her husband about what a wonderful time they were having at Chatsworth. and it said 650 dead, it said, so far on this shoot. It didn't bother to say what the animals were, it just said 650 dead. Everyone's so excited, as you can imagine. That sort of began to happen in the 1750s onwards, and it gave rise to a lot more, particularly pheasants, being crowded together on these estates. And so the gentry started employing a lot more gamekeepers to feed them, because they really cosset them. I mean, a lot of the time the pheasants' eggs were sometimes hatched under chickens, and then when they were little chicks, they would be fed chopped up hard-boiled egg they particularly liked, apparently, and they would really be cosseted until it came to the time of year when they were going to be shot. And with this enormous increase in preserved game, there began to be an enormous increase in poaching as well. And you began to see poaching gangs starting. And the gangs virtually always operated at night. I won't say you never got a gang, i.e. an organised group of poachers. I won't say you never got a gang out during the day. I'm sure you did occasionally, but generally speaking, they were at night. So that increased enormously from the 1750s, and it's accepted that again there was a very big increase in this in the early 1900s as well, because the market for game was increasing enormously. Until 1831, nobody was legally allowed to buy or sell game. The legal situation was that the gentry shot the game where they were allowed to shoot, because they had the status of being allowed to hunt, and they consumed it themselves or they gave it to their friends. They couldn't sell it, nobody could buy it. But of course it was bought and sold, and so there was this enormous black market, sort of, had always existed to some extent, but it started up and became more and more organised, and everybody knew it was going on. And it was just turned. If people saw hampers being loaded onto a coach, and they had that particular smell from them, they realised they were full of game, they would just say nothing about it, or they might even pass a joke to somebody about it. And in fact, I picked up a newspaper cutting. It was a case of body stealers being prosecuted, and I think they were digging up and stealing bodies, weren't they, for dissection. And in fact, these were hampers full of cut-up human corpses that were being loaded onto this stagecoach. But several people who saw it at the time assumed that it was game because it had that particular smell, and they passed joking remarks to the people who were loading it about, "Oh, you've done well, haven't you? You know, you've got a good load of booty there, haven't you?" on the assumption that it was game. So everybody was turning a blind eye to it. And the game preservers, the gentry and the aristocracy who were game preserving, were actually complicit in this breaking of the law as well, because they used to buy a lot of, when it came for the time of the year where they wanted to have eggs of pheasants, partridges to hatch, they would buy them off the poachers, because the poachers would be stealing them, and then the poachers would be selling them. They'd be selling them back to the gamekeepers who would be buying them. And all over the country there were networks, there were black market networks, taking this game to the big towns where it was being sold. On a sort of less organised level, a lot of poachers who were not poaching so heavily as well would just be selling it to people in their village. And there's one book I've got which is the reminiscences of an old countryman, and there's just one chapter about poaching. He was actually in Nottinghamshire, and he was a shoemaker, and he worked in a shop where there were a lot of shoemakers, and they used to go out poaching at night sometimes, these guys. But they didn't feed what they got into the black market network. They just went off the next morning, and what they used to do is they used to collect shoes from people's houses to mend, and then they used to return them when they'd mended them. So they'd have their bags over their back, they'd have the pheasants in there, they'd have a pair of shoes on top of them, and they'd just be taking them to all the different houses in the village to sell them, because they weren't doing it on such a great scale.